Marcus Elton Webb was 39 years old the autumn Charlotte decided to remind him exactly where it thought he stood. He had been with Dominique for 11 years, married for 7 of them, and in all that time he had never once asked her family to acknowledge what he was. He did not need the acknowledgement. He had built something that did not require anyone's applause to remain standing, and he had learned that lesson early. From a woman who raised him in a house on Beatties-Ford Road with no extra rooms and no wasted words, and who told him once, when he was 12 years old and furious about something he could no longer remember, that still water does not announce its depth. He had written that down. He had carried it ever since. What Dominique's family knew about Marcus Webb was carefully curated by what they had chosen to see, which was a quiet man in a good suit who worked in logistics and did not talk much at dinner. What they believed about him was worse than ignorance. It was the specific, settled contempt that comes from a family that has decided a man's worth can be read in his pedigree, and has read his and found it unremarkable. Her father, Reginald Beaumont, had been introducing Marcus to colleagues for 7 years as Dominique's husband who handles freight, the way you describe a piece of furniture by its function. Her brother Darius had a name for him that circulated in the inner ring of the Beaumont family, spoken in the register of jokes that are never quite jokes. The name was Package Deal, as in Dominique came with one. On a Saturday morning in October, at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport FBO terminal that the Beaumont family had rented for a charity aviation fundraiser, an event that Reginald had organized for 11 consecutive years, and that functioned primarily as a showcase for his family's standing in the city's donor class. Dominique Beaumont Webb stood at a microphone in front of 240 people and returned Marcus's ring. She placed it on the podium first. She said she had something to share with the people who mattered most to her. She said she had spent too long shrinking her future to fit someone else's ceiling. She said she wished Marcus nothing but peace. Then she picked up the ring, walked to the chair where he was seated in the 3rd row, and dropped it into his coffee cup. The sound it made was almost nothing, like a small stone finding still water. Reginald Beaumont started the applause. The room followed him the way rooms always followed Reginald. Darius had his phone up before Dominique reached the microphone again, and the caption he would type 14 seconds later, sometimes elevation requires releasing dead weight, would gather 900 comments before Marcus's coffee had gone cold. What none of them knew, what not one person in that rented terminal understood, was that the quiet man in the 3rd row had, at 7:52 that same morning, finalized the acquisition documents that transferred controlling interest in Webb Transit Holdings and its 17 subsidiary infrastructure entities to the consolidated balance sheet of a new corporate parent. His net worth as of that morning was $3 billion. Not a promotion, not a bonus. A decade of invisible architecture executed precisely, completed quietly, and dated that morning in a conference room 12 minutes from where his coffee was now cooling around his wedding ring. They had spent 7 years treating him like luggage. They had no idea he owned the airline. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. You have to go back to understand how a man gets to that chair in the 3rd row with that expression on his face, which was not anger, not grief, not the barely controlled desperation of someone trying to process a humiliation in real time. To understand that face, you have to understand where Marcus Webb came from, and how he got to Charlotte, and what he had been building in the years when Dominique's family had been looking through him. Marcus grew up on Beatties-Ford Road in northwest Charlotte, in the kind of neighborhood that the city's development brochures had been promising to revitalize for 30 years, without quite getting around to it. His mother, Loretta Webb, had worked dispatch for a regional freight carrier for 22 years and raised 2 boys in a house with a small front yard that she kept immaculate, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee at 5 every morning. Because Loretta Webb began every day before the sun had an opinion about it. She was the most organized person Marcus had ever known. She moved freight in her mind the way chess players see the board, 3 moves ahead, every dependency mapped, every bottleneck anticipated before it happened. She told him once, setting a plate in front of him on a school morning when he was 9 years old and already asking questions she loved to answer, that the secret to moving anything from one place to another was that you built the route before you needed it. You did not figure out the path when the cargo was already on the truck. You built it when nobody was watching. You built it before anyone knew there was something worth moving. He had written that down in the small brown notebook he kept in his shirt pocket, the one his mother had given him on the first day of middle school. The notebook had been replaced 11 times since then. The habit had never been replaced once. Marcus was 24 and working as a junior route analyst for a mid-size logistics firm called Piedmont Cargo Solutions when he met Dominique at a fundraiser for the Levine Museum downtown. One of those events where the ticket price ensured that everyone in the room had either earned something substantial or was working very hard to appear as though they had. She was 22 and studying finance at UNC Charlotte, and she was standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water and the particular posture of a woman who had been brought up to understand that how you held yourself in a room was itself a form of communication. She was bright and direct and laughed at something he said about logistics before he had finished saying it, which told him she had actually been listening. They talked for an hour and a half. He drove home afterward on I-277 with both hands on the wheel and wrote 4 words in the notebook at the first red light. He did not need to write more than that. They were married in the spring of 2016. The Beaumont family paid for most of the wedding. That fact was never allowed to recede. Reginald Beaumont had built Beaumont Aviation Partners from a regional charter service into a $190 million a year operation spanning 3 states, and in doing so had arrived at a personal cosmology as fixed as granite. A man was what he had built and what he could display. By those metrics, Marcus Webb registered as a data point that Reginald would have preferred not to include. Beatty's Ford Road. No industry pedigree. A route analyst who had been promoted to Director of Infrastructure Optimization at Piedmont Cargo, which Reginald described at family gatherings as freight coordination with a title attached. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way people say things they want you to absorb as fact rather than opinion. The first Sunday dinner Marcus attended at the Beaumont home in Myers Park, Reginald introduced him to 2 family friends at the door as Dominique's young man from the logistics side. No surname, no title, no acknowledgement that the young man had a field in which he was already doing things Reginald's own industry would eventually spend considerable money trying to understand. Marcus said thank you and went inside and ate the roasted chicken and drove home afterward on Queens Road with his hands exactly as steady as they always were. Darius was 35 and had his father's confidence in larger quantities than his father's judgment. He had a story he told at dinners about a colleague who had married for love rather than sense and spent a decade apologizing for it to everyone who mattered. He told it with the particular artistry of a man who wants you to know he is describing you without saying your name. He always told it looking somewhere slightly past Marcus's left shoulder. Marcus ate his food. He did not rearrange his expression. Dominique had loved Marcus once with something genuine and uncomplicated, in the early years when her family's opinion still competed with her own instincts, rather than winning by forfeit. But somewhere in the first 3 years of marriage, she had made a calculation that she never put into words and never entirely owned. which was that her father's approval was a currency she could not afford to let devalue, and maintaining it required a posture toward Marcus, that she had settled into the way people settle into a posture they have held for too long, no longer noticing it because it had simply become the shape they moved in. When Reginald spoke over Marcus at dinner, she did not redirect. When Darius made his jokes, she refreshed her drink. When colleagues of Reginald's asked what Marcus did, and Reginald answered for him with the wrong title, she smiled and said nothing. She had been performing a version of her marriage for her family's benefit for so long that she had lost the original underneath the performance. And what remained was a woman who had chosen her audience and was now committed to it in ways she could no longer fully see. Marcus saw it. He had seen it for years. And he had continued, methodically and without announcement, to build the thing he had been building since before she knew his last name. Webb Transit Holdings had been incorporated in the state of Delaware in March of 2015, 14 months before the wedding. Marcus had done it on a Wednesday afternoon in the office of an attorney named Claudette Rains on Trade Street, signed the incorporation documents with a pen she had set on the desk without ceremony, and driven back to Beatty's Ford Road that evening to have dinner with his mother and write 4 lines in the notebook before bed. He told Loretta he was working on something. She said she knew. She did not ask what it was, because Loretta Webb had raised a son who did not move anything before the route was built, and she trusted the route. The mechanism he had developed was elegant in the structural sense that truly sound things always are. Through a holding arrangement that Claudette had architected over 18 months, Webb Transit Holdings had been quietly acquiring air cargo infrastructure, ground handling contracts, and regional terminal right-of-way agreements across the Southeast's secondary airport network. Not the major hubs. Those were too visible, too expensive, too contested. The secondary markets, the regional freight terminals in Greenville and Fayetteville, and Columbia and Asheville, the ground handling contracts at 6 mid-tier airports that the major carriers had decided were too small to merit attention and too logistically important to abandon. Marcus moved through those markets the way water moves through limestone, steadily and without announcement, following the path that nobody had thought to watch. By 2020, Webb Transit Holdings controlled the ground infrastructure for 14% of the Southeast's regional air cargo throughput. Nobody had published that number, because nobody had assembled it. It was distributed across 11 subsidiary entities, each of which appeared, to anyone who looked, to be a separate regional contractor, with no visible parent. Dominique knew he traveled for work. She knew there were calls he took in the home office with the door closed. She knew the notebook went everywhere he went. She had asked once, in the 3rd year of their marriage, what was really in it. He had said logistics routing. She had laughed and said that sounded like the most boring possible answer, and he had smiled and agreed with her, and she had gone back to whatever she was doing, and he had written 2 lines in the notebook before bed. The plant was already there, in a small detail he never drew attention to, a laminated FBO access credential on a lanyard in his coat closet. From a terminal in Columbia that she had never thought to ask about. The trouble arrived the way trouble tends to arrive in a marriage that has been cooling for years. Not as a sudden break, but as an accumulation of signals Marcus had been reading since early summer. A change in how Dominique answered her phone when he was in the room, a weekend visit to her parents that ran 2 days longer than scheduled. An envelope on the kitchen counter tucked under a magazine in a way that was almost casual and therefore not casual at all. He noticed without reaction, without confrontation, with the methodical patience of a man who builds the route before the cargo is loaded. He did not say anything. He went to his home office, opened his laptop, and confirmed what the signals had already told him. He sat with that for exactly as long as it took to understand the full dimension of what he was looking at. His hands were entirely still. He opened the notebook. He wrote 2 lines. He closed it. Then he called Claudette Rains the next morning and told her it was time to begin the final stage of the consolidation they had been building toward for 4 years, and that he wanted everything completed before the end of October. The consolidation was Claudette's term for it. The reality was the full maturation of a decade of invisible work. The assembly of all 17 subsidiary entities under the Web Transit Holdings consolidated parent. Completed through a final acquisition, transferring Marcus's brokerage holdings, 3 terminal development agreements, and a regional cargo partnership with Meridian Air Freight into a single capitalized entity. The final number, when everything was assembled, was 2. $3 billion in enterprise value. His personal equity stake, $940 million, fully structured within the premarital entity and entirely outside the scope of any divorce proceeding in North Carolina. Claudette had stated this as legal fact, not reassurance. Marcus had nodded and asked how long execution would take on a Saturday morning. 45 minutes if the parties were prepared. He said to schedule it for 7. She wrote that down without asking why he needed a Saturday. He arrived at Claudette's office on Trade Street at 7 on the dot. She was already at the conference table with the documents arranged in 4 precise stacks and 2 cups of coffee placed exactly equidistant from the edge of the table. She had been his attorney for 10 years, and she did not greet him with small talk. She gestured to the chair across from her and said they should begin. She walked through each document section by section, her finger moving along the margins in the particular unhurried way she had. The way she moved through every closing as though time was a material she was allowed to shape rather than something happening to her. The terminal agreements. The right-of-way consolidation. The Meridian Air Freight partnership transfer. The final valuation statement. She explained that the execution would set the capitalization date as that morning, October 12th, effective at the moment of the last signature. She set the pen on the table at 7:48. Marcus picked it up at 7:52 and signed across 3 signature lines in 28 seconds. Claudette reached across the table and shook his hand once and said it was done. That was all. Neither of them needed more than that. She gathered the documents and set her hands flat on the table and asked one remaining question. She asked about the Beaumont Aviation fundraiser that afternoon without inflection. Because Claudette Rains never asked questions with inflection when the answer was already determined. Marcus said he would attend, he would do nothing unusual, and she should begin the filing sequence Monday through the standard channels. She wrote 2 lines and did not ask why he wanted to attend. She had known Marcus Webb for a decade. She understood that some decisions were not strategic. Some were simply human. He stopped on the way to his car at a coffee cart on Trade Street and stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes in the October light, feeling the specific weight of something finally completed settle into its permanent place in him. Then, he drove to Myers Park to pick up Dominique. She was already by the door, looking at him the way she had been looking at him for months, with the polished surface of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and is waiting for the moment she has selected. He held the door for her. He drove to Charlotte Douglas. He found his seat in the 3rd row, the notebook in his jacket pocket pressing against his ribs the way it always had. He ordered coffee. He waited. He was very patient. By 11 o'clock that morning, the ring was in his coffee cup and Darius's caption was live, and the room full of Charlotte's donor class was still buzzing with the clean satisfaction of having witnessed something they believed was justice. Marcus left the 3rd row without hurry. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket without looking down. He touched the spine of the notebook once through the fabric, the way you confirm the presence of something you already know is there. He set his coffee cup on the empty chair beside his, carefully, without drama, and walked toward the terminal's rear exit, the one that faced the tarmac apron. He pushed through the door. The morning air hit him, cool and carrying the particular smell of jet fuel in October that he had known since his first day at Piedmont Cargo, when a dispatcher named Roy had walked him out onto a regional freight ramp in the early hours and told him that this was where everything that mattered actually happened. Out here. Not in the offices. Not in the meetings, on the ramp where the aircraft and the cargo met, and the routing either worked or it didn't. He stood at the edge of the apron and reached into his jacket and removed the notebook and held it in his right hand. 40 seconds later, the aircraft came around the far corner of the terminal building. It was a Gulfstream G600, matte charcoal, no visible tail livery except the registration number, and a single thin line in dark blue along the fuselage at window level. It moved onto the apron at taxi speed, with the unhurried authority of something that did not need to announce itself. The engines were at idle. The morning light caught the leading edge of the wings with the clean precision of machinery built to function at the highest possible standard, and it rolled to its parking mark 22 feet from where Marcus Webb was standing and stopped. Inside the terminal, the sound reached the room before the sight did. A sustained, low turbine presence that had no business being this close to a ground-level event space. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Darius looked up from his phone. Reginald turned from the person he was speaking to with the slightly furrowed expression of a man who coordinates aviation events and cannot immediately account for this aircraft in his program. Dominique turned last. She turned because the room had turned, and because the particular frequency of those engines was one she recognized from 11 years of being married to a man who was supposed to handle freight. And something in the frequency was wrong for freight. Wrong for the terminal's scheduled program. Wrong in a way that her body registered before her mind had formed a question. She looked through the glass of the terminal's rear wall and saw the aircraft. She saw the apron. She saw the tail number. Then she saw Marcus, standing at the edge of the ramp with his jacket on and the notebook in his hand, and two men in ground crew uniforms moving to position the air stair, and behind him, through the glass of the Gulfstream's forward window. A figure she recognized from the one time she had met him, Claudette Rains, seated at the forward cabin table with a document folder open in front of her. Dominique did not move. That was the thing that happened to her in that moment, the thing that was visible to everyone who was watching, which was everyone. She simply stopped. The forward motion of her morning, the certainty of the script she had been running, the applause that was still reverberating in the memory of the room, all of it met the sight of that aircraft and the man standing beside it, and produced in her a stillness so complete that the people nearest her would describe it later, in different words, but the same substance, as watching someone understand something they could not undo. Darius looked from the aircraft to his sister to his father, and back to the aircraft, and said nothing. Reginald Beaumont, who had organized 11 aviation fundraisers and could identify most regional aircraft by silhouette, looked at the tail number on the Gulfstream, and then looked at his son. And the expression on his face was one that no one in the Beaumont family had seen before, because it was the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the floor he has been standing on belongs to someone else. Marcus did not look back at the terminal. He did not look through the glass to find Dominique's face. He stood at the edge of the apron, and the door of the Gulfstream opened, and the air stair descended, and Claudette Rains appeared at the top of it with the document folder under her arm, and Marcus walked to the base of the stair and placed one foot on the first step. He paused there for a moment, not for effect, but because the morning was genuinely good and Charlotte was lit the way it gets in October when the sky is high and clear. And he had been building toward this morning for 10 years, and he understood that some moments deserved a breath before you moved through them. A man who lays the route before the cargo is loaded knows when he has finally reached the destination. He was halfway up the air stair when Claudette leaned down and said the Monday filings were confirmed and that the trade publication announcement was already drafted. He nodded. He did not look back at the terminal. He had decided. Somewhere in the 10 seconds between touching the spine of the notebook and stepping onto the tarmac, that he would not look back. Not out of contempt, not out of ceremony. Because the story he had been writing for 10 years was not about that room. It had never been about that room. He had been building routes that room had never thought to look for, and now the last one was complete, and there was nothing left in that direction that required his attention. He stepped up into the aircraft. The door closed behind him with the sealed, absolute sound of something that has been engineered to keep the outside world precisely where it belongs. Claudette sat across from him in the forward cabin and opened the document folder on the table between them. The morning sun came through the oval window and caught the edges of the pages. The engines spooled up from idle to their departure register, and the aircraft began its slow turn on the apron. Marcus opened the notebook to the last written page and read the 2 lines he had written the morning after he confirmed what he already knew. Then he turned to the next blank page and wrote 4 words and closed it. He set it on the table and looked out the window as Charlotte Douglas fell away beneath them, and the city arranged itself into the geometry it always had from altitude, where the roads and the neighborhoods and the buildings all resolved into the patterns they had always been following, visible only from high enough up, and only to the people who had taken the time to get there. 3 weeks after the October fundraiser, the world had already begun organizing itself into its new permanent shape. With the speed that always follows a decade of invisible preparation when it finally becomes visible, Claudette filed the Web Transit Holdings consolidated documentation with the SEC through the standard disclosure channels on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, 2 trade publications had picked up the registration filing. By Thursday, the Charlotte Business Journal ran the item under a headline that Marcus would not read until he landed back in the city on Friday evening. The headline read, "Dilworth-raised logistics entrepreneur Web Transit Holdings revealed as Southeast's largest regional air cargo infrastructure holder." The article was 11 paragraphs. It named Marcus Webb as founder and sole equity holder. It described the 17-entity subsidiary structure. It mentioned the Meridian Air Freight Partnership. It included his name and his title and his city correctly for the first time in any publication anywhere. Darius read the article on his phone while sitting in the parking lot of the Beaumont Aviation offices on Wednesday morning. He sat there for a long time without going inside. Reginald received the article from his operations director, who had flagged it as relevant to Beaumont Aviation's competitive landscape without initially recognizing the name. Reginald read it once standing. He read it again sitting down. He picked up his phone to call Dominique and set it back down without dialing. The divorce filings were already with both attorneys. Dominique's lawyer, Rachel Ford, who handled high-asset cases out of a firm on South Tryon, opened the Web Transit Holdings Incorporation documents and sat very still for several minutes before calling her client. She explained the premarital incorporation date. She explained the structure. Everything of substance had been held within the Delaware entity since March of 2015, 14 months before the wedding. She used the word insulated. She said it once and did not repeat it. Dominique asked what that meant for the Dilworth house. Rachel Ford told her. Dominique was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked about the notebook. Rachel Ford did not know what she meant. Marcus was in a conference room at Claudette's offices on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later when Dominique's attorney filed the final settlement response. He was drinking coffee and reviewing a terminal expansion study for the Asheville Regional Facility, and he did not stop reading when Claudette set the response on the table beside him. He read it after he finished the expansion study. He nodded once. He told Claudette to finalize the settlement structure they had discussed and to make it fair. Claudette said the settlement was already more than the law required. Marcus said it was exactly what it should be and did not revisit the point. Dominique received a settlement of $1, $8 million cash, a paid vehicle, and a clean financial foundation. Nothing she had a legal claim to. Everything Marcus had determined she deserved. Because precision and cruelty are not the same instrument, and Marcus Webb had never once confused them. Darius deleted the LinkedIn post in November. The screenshots were, of course, permanent. He understood that now with the particular clarity that comes from discovering the caption you wrote about dead weight referred to a man worth nearly $1 billion. The aviation donor class in Charlotte is not a large community. Darius understood this also. He transitioned out of the Beaumont Aviation Marketing Director role in January and took a position in commercial real estate in Raleigh, which was a sensible distance from Charlotte, without requiring a full explanation. Reginald Beaumont announced a strategic restructuring of Beaumont Aviation Partners in February. The press release used words like evolution and realignment and said nothing about the fact that 2 of the firm's largest cargo handling contracts had quietly migrated, through entirely legal and standard market processes, to regional infrastructure operators that contracted through Webb Transit Holdings' subsidiary network. Reginald would retire by the spring. The standing ovation he had started in that FBO terminal was the last room that would ever rise for him in that register. Dominique relocated to Raleigh in January as well, though to a different part of the city than Darius, which was its own kind of statement. She took a position with a nonprofit focused on regional workforce development, which was genuinely good work, and she was genuinely good at it, and the Charlotte Donor Circuit, where her family name had always preceded her, was a comfortable distance away. She set her social media to private in November and has not changed that setting since. She is building something quieter than what she came from. That is not. Nothing. By the following spring, Marcus had moved the Webb Transit Holdings headquarters into a renovated building on South Boulevard that he had purchased through a subsidiary in 2019 and held until the time was right. The building had good light and a rooftop terrace where the city's skyline was visible in 3 directions and the airport was visible in the 4th. He had put his mother's photograph on the wall of the conference room, not as decoration, as a fixed point. Loretta Webb had died in December of 2022, 14 months before the October morning at the FBO terminal, and there was not a single day in those 14 months that Marcus had not wished she could have held on long enough to see it. She had known what he was building. Not the specific dollar amount, not the SEC filing, but the shape of it, the infrastructure of it. The fact that her son had laid the route before the cargo was loaded and had not deviated from it once in 10 years of people looking through him at dinner tables. She would not have been surprised by the Gulf Stream. She would have said she knew. She would have told him to eat something. The foundation he announced in March was called the Loretta Webb Infrastructure Fellowship. 12 scholars per cohort, selected from Beatty's Ford Road and the surrounding neighborhoods, studying logistics, supply chain management, and aviation operations at universities across the state. The endowment was $18 million. The first cohort would begin the following fall. When the local Charlotte paper ran the story, Marcus's phone rang 4 times in the first hour, with calls from people who had grown up on Beatty's Ford Road, and he answered every one of them. He sat at his desk on South Boulevard with the city visible through the window and the notebook open to a new page, and he talked to each person for as long as they needed. The woman who sat down across from him at a colleagues' gathering in Washington, that April was named Priya Anand, a transportation infrastructure attorney out of a Georgetown practice. She saw the notebook on the table and asked about it directly and without preamble. He told her about his mother's dispatch metaphor, the 11 replaced notebooks and the unbroken habit, the October morning on the tarmac when he had stopped halfway up the air stair and understood that everything he had been moving toward had arrived. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked what the last 4 words were that he had written on the aircraft. He told her. She said that was a good 4 words. He agreed. She refilled his water glass without being asked, and they kept talking until the gathering had wound down around them. He wrote 3 words in the notebook at the hotel that night and closed it and slept without difficulty. There are people in this world who spend their entire lives confusing a man's patience with his permanent position. They look at what he does not announce and decide it is what he does not possess. They look at where he started and decide they can see where he will end. They perform their certainty about him in public and applaud for each other, and they do not understand until the aircraft appears on the apron and the engines speak in a register that requires no translation, that silence is not absence. It is architecture. It is the route. Built before anyone knew there was something worth moving. Some men build that route in full over a decade of dinner tables, where people said his name incorrectly, and he said thank you, and drove home with his hand steady on the wheel. And when the route is complete, there is nothing theatrical about using it. You walk to the aircraft. You climb the stair. You go where you have always been going, and the room watches through the glass and finally understands what it has been looking at the whole time. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.